the North Atlantic, year 985. Waves the size of buildings, frost on every rope. 32 men in an open boat. No cabin, no walls, no roof, and no fire. Not a single flame. These men are about to spend approximately 18 days in conditions that would kill you or me in hours. Out in the open sea, sub-zero wind, no shelter. And somehow, almost all of them will survive. Not because they were tougher than the cold, because they built a system to beat it. A system with layers that modern researchers are still pulling apart today. That's what this video is about. Every layer, every detail. And the last one? It has nothing to do with the ship itself. Let me ask you something. If you were building a vessel to cross the deadliest ocean on Earth, what's the first thing you'd put on it? Some kind of heating system, right? The Vikings didn't. And we know this for a fact, because we found their ships, the Gokstad ship, excavated from a burial mound in Norway in 1880. It's 23 meters long and 5 meters wide. That's roughly a tennis court in length, but barely wider than a minivan. Now, try to fit 35 men into that space. Their weapons, their food, their cargo. How much space is left per person? It's barely enough to stretch out, right? And this thing was open. No deck overhead, no enclosed cabin below. The side walls rose about 1 meter above the waterline. That's it. Every wave that broke over the bow hit the crew directly. Every gust of wind reached them with nothing in the way. Now here's where it gets serious. Winter surface temperatures in those waters hover around 2 degrees. Air temperature? Regularly, -20. Wind chill pushes it far below that. At those levels, exposed skin starts to suffer frostbite in under 10 minutes. And here's a number worth sitting with. Modern hypothermia research shows that a person in 2-degree water loses consciousness in under 15 minutes. You don't slowly get cold, you shut down. Even without falling in, prolonged exposure to sub-zero wind on an open vessel drains your core temperature hour by hour. Without intervention, it kills you. So why not just light a fire? Think about what materials are used to build longships. Pine and oak planks, stacked one on top of the other, sealed with tarred animal hair. Rope, woolen sailcloth treated with animal fat. Every surface is flammable. The hull flexes with every wave crash. Any spark ignites, any ember rolls, and the ship that keeps you alive becomes your coffin. And the Vikings understood this better than anyone who lived it. Fire was central to everything on land. Every longhouse had a hearth burning all night. Their avoidance of fire at sea wasn't due to primitiveness. They avoided it because they understood engineering well enough to know what fire would do to a wind-swept, flexing wooden hull. That's what this video actually answers. How do you keep 30 men alive for weeks on an open wooden platform atop a freezing ocean in sub-zero conditions without fire? The most important survival tool in human history? Here's the thing. The answer isn't one solution. It's a system. And each layer is more clever than the last. Before we get into it, let's kill a myth. There's this popular image of Vikings as hard men who just gutted it out, gritted their teeth and suffered through the cold. Tough guys in tough conditions. That's not what happened, not even close. What the archaeology shows is the exact opposite. Every element of their approach to cold at sea was calculated. Deliberate material choices, layered insulation principles, an understanding of how heat works that science wouldn't formally describe for another 800 years. These weren't men who endured the cold. These were engineers who removed it from the equation, layer by layer. And what they built tells us more about Viking intelligence than any saga ever written. Start with what touched their skin. Wool! But not wool like you're thinking of. Viking Age wool was a completely different material from the soft, processed stuff you'd buy today. Norse sheep produced a dual-coat fleece. The outer layer, long, coarse guard hairs called tog. The inner layer, dense, fine fibers called thell. Together, they created something remarkable. Water-resistant on the outside, heat-trapping on the inside. But here's the detail that changes everything. The Vikings hardly ever washed their wool. They usually just rinsed it in cold seawater. It might sound dirty and disgusting, but it wasn't. It was ingenious, because this meant it preserved the wool's lanolin and the natural waxy oil from the sheep's skin. Lanolin is hydrophobic. It repels water. Even today, a lanolin-rich tunic won't absorb rain or drizzle. It will run off. And we're not just guessing here. Textile fragments from the Birka burial site in Sweden and the Oseberg burial site in Norway confirm what we're saying. Tight, dense weaves, diamond twill patterns designed to trap heat and block wind. Researchers at the National Museum of Denmark tested recreated Viking garments and found something remarkable. Even when wet, they retain 80% of their insulation capacity. Yes, you heard that right. 80%, even when wet. Modern synthetic undergarments, the ones marketed to soldiers and mountaineers, lose a significant amount of heat when wet. But Viking wool, it kept working. Now there's a real debate here. Some scholars say this was accidental. Vikings just used what their sheep gave them. Others argue the evidence points to deliberate textile engineering, refined across generations of trial at sea. Accident or mastery? It's a question worth arguing over. Drop your take below. The system was layered. Against the skin, a lane, a light undergarment made of fine wool or linen. Over this, a heavier kirtil, the main woolen tunic. Over this, a thick outer cloak, often treated with tallow or beeswax for extra water resistance. Each layer created a pocket of trapped air between itself and the next. And here's the modern connection that puts this into perspective. Go to any outdoor store today, and you'll see the exact same system being sold back to you. An inner layer for moisture management, an insulation layer for warmth, shell layer for wind and water protection. 3 layers, 3 functions. This is modern mountaineering science developed in laboratories, wind tunnels, and with synthetic polymers. The Vikings arrived at the same principle with sheep, looms, and 1,000 years of North Atlantic crossings. The engineering is the same, only the materials have changed. The difference, of course, is the price. In the past, a Viking wool tunic cost about the same as a silver bracelet. A modern 3-layer Gore-Tex system, however, is expensive enough to make you question your life choices while waiting in line to pay. Clothing managed heat loss from the body, but you're still sitting inside a thin wooden shell, floating on an ocean close to freezing point. The cold doesn't just come from the air, it radiates upward from the hull, the deck, everything your body touches. This is the point that most accounts of Viking seafaring completely miss. The ship itself was thermal protection. The clinker construction, a Scandinavian signature, means each plank overlaps the one below it. Riveted, sealed with tarred wool or animal hair. This was designed for flexibility. A clinker-built hull flexes with the waves rather than fighting them. This is why longships survived in seas that would split a rigid hull in two. But that overlapping structure did something else. Each layer trapped a thin pocket of air between the planks, along the hull's interior. Individually, they were minuscule. Collectively, they created a constant layer of still air between the crew and the freezing ocean on the other side. The brushed wool filling, itself an insulator, added another layer on top of that. Was this dramatic insulation? No. But survival engineering doesn't work in dramatic leaps. It works in small increments. When trying to stay above the line where your body begins to fail, every fraction of a degree matters. What comes next is a strategy so simple it almost sounds too obvious, until you realize modern navies took centuries to arrive at the same conclusion. If this is the kind of detail you come here for, a like takes a second and genuinely helps. Now, let's talk about wind. The Norse used their sail as more than propulsion. Saga accounts and experimental archaeology, especially the Skuldelev ship reconstruction sailed out of Denmark in the 1990s, show that crews repositioned the sail as a windbreak when conditions worsened. They'd lower it partially and angle it across the beam, not for speed, for shelter. Some accounts go further. Spare sailcloth rigged over the midsection of the ship, a makeshift canopy. Not a cabin, nothing close, just enough to block the direct blast of Arctic wind from hitting the crew full force. Wadmal, a thick, dense woven wool fabric, was the material of choice. It blocked wind while still allowing enough airflow to prevent dangerous condensation buildup underneath. Here's why that matters more than you'd think. Reducing wind speed across the body by 50% can double the time before hypothermia sets in. Double it. That's not a small number. The Norse knew this, not from a textbook, but from centuries of watching what kept men alive and what didn't. If you've ever been on open water in bad weather, or spent a night in an exposed position, you know what one windbreak can do. The difference between wind on your face and wind blocked by even a thin barrier isn't minor. It changes whether you can think, whether you can use your hands, whether you can keep going. Some of you know exactly what I'm describing. Now we get to the most sophisticated part, and the most human. Viking crews didn't sleep alone. They slept in organized groups, packed into shared sleeping bags called hodfat. These were large sacks made from walrus or seal hide, fur turned inward. Each one held 2 to 3 men. The hide blocked wind and water. The fur trapped warmth. And the bodies inside? They were the heat source. This wasn't improvised. The saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red both mention hodfat as standard equipment, as essential as the sail or the oars. You didn't set out on a North Atlantic crossing without them. Archaeological evidence from Norse Greenland settlements has also uncovered fragments of hide sacks consistent with these descriptions. This was real gear, planned, built, and maintained like any other piece of the ship. Here's how the system worked. Crews rotated in shifts, rowing, watch duty, rest. The sleeping sacks were almost never empty and almost never cold. A man, coming off a 4-hour rowing shift, his body pumping serious metabolic heat, would climb into a hodfat still warm from the last occupant. The next man would take the oars, already rested. Think about the efficiency of that. No heat source was wasted. No sack went cold. The rotation itself was the engine that kept the system running. Now ask yourself, how much heat are we actually talking about? A resting human body produces roughly 80 watts of thermal energy. 2 men in one sealed hide sack? 160 watts. That's a large light bulb. In a space the size of a coffin, with wind and water blocked by thick animal hide, interior temperatures could climb 15 to 20 degrees above the outside air. That's not comfort. but it's survival, and it's pure physics. And there's one more thing. The hood fat didn't just keep men warm, it kept them alive psychologically, in darkness, in freezing wind, in conditions that could break a man's will. The physical closeness of other bodies was a reminder that you were not alone, that the crew was still intact, that the system was still holding. The level of comfort, it must be admitted, was below the desired level. Imagine rowing for 30 hours in the open ocean on a diet of dried cod and fermented skyr, then crawling into a damp sealskin sack with 2 other men doing exactly the same thing. And that smell. If the Norse had published recruitment posters, the creative department would have earned hazard pay. But here's the truth about it. Shared body heat is not a theory. It is one of the oldest survival techniques known to humankind. If you've ever huddled in a bivouac sack, spent the night in a foxhole during military service, or undergone cold water survival training, you know it works. You felt it work. If that moment just flashed before your eyes, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Here's what almost never appears in the popular version of this story, and it might be the most impressive layer of all. The Vikings didn't just manage the cold on the ship, they managed their entire route to minimize exposure to it. Archaeological surveys have identified over 200 Viking-age harborage sites along the Norwegian coast alone. These weren't random anchorages, they were infrastructure, positioned roughly a day's sailing apart. Sheltered bays where crews beached their ships, lit fires on shore, cooked hot food, dried soaked clothing, and restored core body temperature before pushing to the next waypoint. The longest open water crossing in the Viking world, Norway to Iceland, covered roughly 900 nautical miles. At average longship speeds, that's 4 to 6 days of continuous exposure. And the Norse overwhelmingly sailed it in summer, late May through August, when daylight stretched past 20 hours and air temperatures stayed survivable. When winter sailing was unavoidable, they hugged the coast. Short hops, harbor to harbor. Never more exposure than the system could handle. Consider what that means when you put the whole picture together. The Viking survival system wasn't just wool and hide and body heat. It was a logistical network spanning thousands of miles of coastline, harbors, seasonal timing, route selection, weather reading passed down through oral tradition. A maritime infrastructure that the rest of Western Europe wouldn't match for another half a millennium. That's not survival instinct. That's the architecture of a civilization that understood the sea better than anyone on Earth. Step back from the details for a moment and look at the entire system. These men crossed some of the most dangerous water on Earth in open wooden boats. No engines, no weather satellites, no thermal gear designed in a lab. What they had was a system. Wool that science took centuries to improve on. Ship design that doubled as thermal architecture. Sleeping arrangements that turned human bodies into heating units. And a logistics network stretching across the North Atlantic. None of it was accidental. Every layer was the product of generations of knowledge, tested, refined, and paid for in lives. The wool wasn't random. The ship design wasn't coincidence. The hood fat weren't desperate. And the harbor network wasn't luck. It was all one system, designed by people who understood their environment with a precision we're still catching up to. They weren't survivors in the way we usually mean that word. People who got lucky. They were engineers of survival. Every crossing was a calculated operation. If what matters to you is history, not Hollywood raids, not horned helmets, but how these people really thought and how they solved problems no one else could. how they were brilliant engineers, then this channel is for you. Subscribing means you'll be here to see what happens next. And there's so much more to tell. The next time you turn up the heating on a cold night, consider this. 1,000 years ago, men crossed Arctic seas with nothing but wool, hide, and each other. And every single system they built still makes sense today.